beautiful plant people. If we haven't met before, I am Sam, the proud owner of Plant Collector Melbourne, and also the individual that did a 4-year bachelor degree in science. And today we are going to be continuing our science, playlist or educational videos, and we are going to be talking about root rot and also stem rot today. So without further ado, let's get into it. So if you've clicked on this video, chances are that you have a plant that is experiencing root rot or stem rot. And I am here to tell you that just because your plant has rot doesn't necessarily mean that there is no way of recovering from it, that it is going to die. And hopefully this video will give you a better understanding of what root rot or stem rot is, what causes it, and how we can avoid it or treat it. Let's start off with what is it? What is root or stem rot? And it is a condition in which there is low oxygen in either the soil or potting media, which causes the plant roots to rot. So damage can vary. It can be quite a slow process, and sometimes it can actually be quite fast. And so in my personal experience, I find that older plants are actually able to combat or able to kind of bounce back from root rot a lot easier than smaller plants, and that is because their root system is more established. So if you manage to catch root rot early and you're chopping off all of the dead roots, then you would see that there's still a big system to support the plant. I find that smaller plants with smaller root systems actually take a big chunk out of the roots, and sometimes that will inevitably mean that the plant may go down south. Let's talk about what causes it, and that way we can better prepare ourselves to either avoid it or how to treat it. So in the understanding of what causes it. So as stated before, that this condition is a low amount of oxygen within the soil or media. And this condition can also be called hypoxia or anoxia. And there's a couple of things that we can do that actually causes this lack of oxygen for the roots. So I'm going to name 4 things that I think are well known about root rot, and then we're also going to be talking about something called dry rot. So there are 4 things that I like to think are like the pillars or the main causes of root rot. One of them is overwatering. So just like any other organic material in your home, that if it is sitting in water and there is not a lot of oxygen or flow in, the water, then things will start to rot. Another thing that can cause root rot is having soil or media that is too dense for the plant, in which case that water doesn't dry out fast enough for the plant. The next is very much on the same wavelength as to having dense soil, and that is having poor drainage. So poor drainage in the soil, or it could be poor drainage in your pot. So thinking about if your pot has lots of little drainage holes at the bottom, or even if it doesn't and it's in something more like a cache pot. And another one to think about is that pathogens or microorganisms such as bacteria or fungi can definitely play a part in rot, and even things like mold. So here is something that I feel like I may have said on my channel before, but not a lot of people are addressing it or saying that it is a thing. And through experience, that I think the number one thing that gets plant rot is overwatering, and then the others are definitely factors that play into it. But something that not a lot of people talk about is dry rot. And dry rot is when you have underwatered the plant to the point where the roots start to shrivel and dry up, and then you water the plant excessively or overwater it, and then that dead shriveled up roots actually becomes rot. So yes, it is a case of overwatering, and also it can be a case of underwatering that causes the rot. It is definitely the infrequent watering that will do the job of doing dry rot. And this is the second one that I feel like no one really talks about. And every time I do repotting, I tend to mention this, but not necessarily say why. And that is when you're repotting and you have gaps or big holes in your soil or media, that is a no-go. That is that if there are roots that are in that kind of climate, yes, that those pockets might be able to hold humidity, but there's not enough moisture for the roots in comparison to if it was actually like compacted with soil. So this might sound a bit counterintuitive for some of you, but what ends up happening here is that the root that is in this like gap, if there's not sufficient amount of water, it will dry out, causing dry rot, and then of course overwatering, which of course would cause the rot. Let's talk about some signs and symptoms that the plant may be experiencing that will give you an indication or possibly flag that this plant is experiencing rot. And so one of the very first things that will happen is that lower leaves tend to go fully yellow and drop. And this can happen really quickly. So sometimes you can have leaves that turn yellow slowly and they're just old, so that they will be on their way out. If you are experiencing some fast root rot, then you will see yellow leaves will fall and go yellow very, very quickly. So that is one of the main signs that I find. You will also find that some of the leaves will start to shrivel or actually fold in on itself. Sometimes you will see that the leaves are quite thin, and a lot of the time the leaves will curl. So they will start to look a little bit something like this, and most likely will be going yellow. Some other indications, and this is beneath the soil, so this is not just signs that you can see on the leaves. If you pull the plant out from its media and look at the roots, if you give it a smell, chances are that it has like this foul, rotting smell, and it's the worse the rot is, the worse the smell. And last but certainly not least, if you are growing plants in like clear plastic pots, which is one of my recommendations, is that you will actually get to see the roots and whether they are healthy or not healthy. What you're trying to look for here is the color of the roots and also kind of the quality of the root. If they are white and they are plump, of course, and also if they're fuzzy, that is definitely an indication of a happy root system that is very healthy. But if the roots are quite brown, if they are shriveled, if they are flat rather than round and plump, that is dead roots. Now, with a little bit of understanding of what causes it, this is the portion of the video where we can take those and do things to avoid root rot. So again, I'll bring you back to the idea that this is when there is low oxygen in the soil. So these things will actually improve the oxygen in the soil, or you can try to avoid things like overwatering. Number one is to use the appropriate media for the plant. So you aren't going to be using something that is incredibly dense. For example, if you do like using potting mix or soil, then I would highly recommend putting amendments to better the drainage, which means that there is better oxygen in the soil for the plant. So things like perlite or vermiculite or pumice, and also charcoal. It goes without saying that because one of the main issues is overwatering, is try to avoid overwatering, and better yet, try to be more consistent with your watering. The next one is knowing what plants are susceptible to rot. And I think that I only know this through trial and error, but for example, I know that monsteras for me have always been very susceptible to root rot, and also Anthurium luxurians, which of course is the guy that I'm going to be demonstrating on how to deal with root rot. I'm wondering if you guys can see the roots. So here we've got some brown roots that are not looking too hot or healthy, but given there is definitely some sort of healthy roots, otherwise this guy would go. So yes, this is my very sad, many leaves lost luxurians. As I have mentioned before, when you are repotting, just making sure that you are compacting the soil, really pressing down to ensure that you have no holes or gaps in the media. Time and time again, I will continue to say this, that I will always recommend clear pots for all of your special plants. There is definitely an argument saying that roots want darkness, which is completely true, but I do think that I would prefer to be able to see the roots so that if something were not looking great, that I can actually see whether rot is happening without actually taking the plant out of its pot. And I guess you are very much welcome to put the clear pot into a cache pot or ceramic so that is able to be dark, and then just being able to like take it out and see with the clear pot whether something is up or not. Now, let us talk about how we are going to treat it, because I think that majority of you that have clicked on this video, yes, it is great to have an understanding of, I guess, root rot and stem rot, but really it's time for application. How we can treat and save your plant baby. When we start to think of the soil and the media in which the plants are in, what tends to happen is with rot is that there is a bigger portion of, say, bad microorganisms such as bacteria or fungus. And so what we tend to do when we are trying to treat it is use anti-fungicides. Unfortunately, there may not be any like antibacterial that we can use. We do use two things in the store to combat rot. And this is microkill, and I know that it looks incredibly nuclear and scary. It is almost like a detergent. It is a soap. It is made out of oranges and the yucca tree, but what this tends to do is be used as a disinfectant. So we use that, as well as if we are going for something incredibly nuclear, because I feel like that is more like natural. We also have this guy, which is Oxy Plus, also known as hydrogen peroxide. So what this is 50% hydrogen peroxide, which is incredibly strong. You can actually get hydrogen peroxide from groceries or a chemist. They are more like 3%. So this guy is clearly more bang for your buck, but I guess that the 3% and the other ones are a lot more accessible. There are roughly about 8 to 9 steps that we can do to help save your plant. So the first step is preparing your solution. So whether that is hydrogen peroxide or microkill or some sort of antifungal, antibacterial, you will be using either the instructions that are given on the product or find on Google. I might even just leave below a ratio that will help you depending on like your concentration, but just mixing up a good amount of your solution. And number 2, this one is a funny one because it's definitely do as I say but not what I do, because this one I tend to skip, but it is actually very important for your plant. And it is disinfect your tools. So you're going to be using scissors or secateurs. I highly recommend dipping those tools into the solution that you have made to disinfect them. Number 3 is optional, and this is more for if your plant is severely going through root rot. It is a really great idea to actually chop off some of the lower leaves. You can think of this as the plant is going to be trying to survive, and it might be holding on to too many leaves and focusing on holding them. A recommendation here that I normally have, whether that is for propagating or this, is to think about the roots to leaves ratio. If a lot of the roots have died off because of rot, it will not be able to hold a lot of the leaves. If you have a small amount of system or roots, then I highly recommend taking a lot of the leaves off. And if it's got a large root system, then it will be able to hold more leaves. Step number 5 is definitely a recommendation to dispose of the soil. Number 6, we are going to be drenching the root system into our solution. For me personally, I allow it to soak for about 5 to 10 minutes. This is so that the solution is able to penetrate like the whole root rather than just like the surface of it. I do have friends and other individuals that I know that actually spray the solution onto the root system, but in my personal experience, I do feel that soaking it is better. Number 7 is that we are going to allow it to dry and also, very importantly, not be in direct sunlight. There are times where I have done this for whether that is like root rot and doing this process, but also if I'm just doing propagations and I leave a plant out, there's been times when I've actually cooked them in the sun. So I highly recommend you don't do that. Moving on to step number 8, and it is cutting off all of the dead roots. So here you're going to use your scissors or your succators. So we're going to take this one with a grain of salt because it also depends on several factors. My tip here is to cut slightly higher than the dead roots, and that does mean that you are going to be cutting into some healthy roots, but it's actually just a better chance at nipping the rot in the butt, if that makes sense. So if you have a plant that has lots of root system, then you are more than welcome to kind of like to cut further down and get a little bit more of the healthy root. But if you have a plant that is not so healthy, not a lot of root, then you can't really go much higher. Another tip is that if you have sharper scissors, it works out better. And this is a tip that I like to talk about when I'm propagating as well. You can imagine that if you are cutting something that if it is sharp and is very much more of a clean cut, there is less damage to the plant and the roots. So here I like to think of surgery, and that if you used a sharp tool versus like a blunt tool, there's going to be more damage if it is not as sharp. If you can imagine like scissors that are not as sharp, that they are actually compressing and collapsing the stem or the roots. So the sharper, the better. So number 10, we are going to be talking about the pots. And here I would suggest just grabbing a new pot so that you are starting fresh and clean. But in case you wish to kind of like reuse your resources or your pots, you are more than welcome to disinfect the old pot. Number 11 is easy enough, and we are just repotting the plant back again. Once you have the plant all potted up and looking gorgeous, then you can resume watering. And with watering, I do recommend that you water moderately. So typically when I tell people how to water, it is that you want all the soil to have water, and so that all the roots have access to water. And when it comes to root rot, because you want to try and avoid overwatering, you do want to pull back the watering just a little bit, but not underdo it either. So we're not talking about, I'm just going to give a glass of water to the plant. We are going to do more, but it's definitely not as much as what you would do originally. So what I like to do is when I'm watering, I like to make my little cocktail of Growth Technology CCS and Root Zone, which are these two guys. This is definitely my favorite cocktail when it comes to younger plants, but also plants that need to focus on the roots and or are stressing. Root Zone will typically look after the microbiome and the health of the soil, whereas CCS is going to encourage the plant to get new roots. So that is why I like to mix that little cocktail together. And I'd also like to add that when you are watering, I mentioned it before and I'll mention it again, the more consistent you are with your watering, the less chance that you'll be able to under and over water it. And so whether that is like the wet rot or the dry rot, consistency is key. The next step is quite optional, and this will only be an option for individuals where the plant is still, it's undergoing rot, but it's not completely dying. So you still need quite the healthy plant to do this. The option here is to actually take a cutting or a propagation just as an insurance for the plant. So even if that the plant is like going to die, if you've taken a cutting, it's kind of your backup. I do want to stress that the plant has to be healthy. If the plant is not healthy and you're taking a cutting, the chances of it actually working is quite low. So we've been talking a lot about root rot, but I also want to just touch on stem rot because it is incredibly similar and the treatment is technically the same. It is caused by the exact same things, but I would do something slightly different here. And that is if the stem is still intact, but there are no roots whatsoever, I would definitely cut off the leaves, and also put that stem or that chunk into like a propagation box. So I'm just going to go grab it. So here I have 2 of our propagation boxes of when plants were rotting, and here is our newest one, which I'll get you guys to take a look. See, and it's got perlite and all of these like stems that are still healthy but definitely do not have any roots. So the exact same, I guess, method as if it was going to be rot, and it's cutting off all of the dead cells, whether that is roots. If the stem is running itself, I do highly recommend, whether that is like with a knife or just even with your hands, removing any of the mushy bits or the, I guess, dying stem, and making sure that all the brown is gone until you get to the healthy stem. So very similar to root rot is that we're trying to get rid of the dead debris. And once you have your stem, I do highly recommend either spraying or actually submerging it into your chosen solution, whether it is hydrogen peroxide or an antifungal, etc., etc. But then putting it in a box like this with, I guess, any kind of media that you're comfortable with as if you were propagating. So here in this one, we've got jumbo perlite at the bottom and then sphagnum moss, and they have been saved. These plants have been saved. Would you look at it? So I have actually saved quite a lot of plants with this method. And yes, you are going to lose some plants to rot. That is unfortunately the case, and particularly if you don't catch the rot fast enough, but that doesn't mean that the plant is dead. So hopefully with this video, with these instructions, and also with the knowledge of knowing what causes it and how to avoid it, that you guys will be better prepared for when your plant is experiencing rot. So that pretty much wraps up this week's video. Thank you so much for watching another one of our plant sciencey series, and I'm hoping this video makes you think to not give up on your plants that have rot. Let's chat down in the comments. If you guys have any tips or tricks with plants that experience rot, feel free to leave it down below. I would love to hear some wild miracle stories of a plant that was on the brink of death because of rot but then magically came to life again. I would love for you to share it with our community. If you are enjoying this planty series, please let us know. I'm going to also put a link to our playlist up above for you guys to, of course, watch at your leisure. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!